What I will say about Wentz, though, is, I talked to people with the Eagles. I talked to people with the Colts, more so really, frankly, with Indianapolis. And there is concern about his ability to just kind of get along. And it's not that he's a bad guy.
Mac guys here on Birds 365 on the JAKIB Media YouTube channel. As we told you earlier in the week, we wanted to touch base with each and every three other teams in the division. We did the Cowboys earlier this week. It's a Redskin / football team / Commander. Here on the JAKIB Media YouTube channel. And we got one of the best who covered them down in D.C., Brent Paulsen for 106.7 The Fan, down there in our nation's capital, who is outside. It's that nice a day, Paulsen. You can do this from outside?
For now. It's supposed to be like 72 degrees, but they're talking about thunderstorms. So I got two little kids running around the house. I said, I'll step outside. And now I got a neighbor's dog barking, so we'll see if we can make it work.
It's nice up here as well, Grant. We get one 70-degree day, and then we'll be back in the muck soon enough. So let's enjoy it. You're doing the right thing. Is Washington enjoying the new commander down there, our old buddy Carson Wentz? How is that going over, bringing in Carson Wentz to be the QB1 inside the Beltway?
Yeah, I think people are really skeptical. But here's the good news, I guess, for Washington, sadly enough, is that he's a massive upgrade over what they've had recently. I think there's a couple ways to view this, right? The first of them is that he is better than Taylor Heineke was last year. He is better than what they have been dealing with over the last several years. They have not had a quarterback that gave him a real chance to win a ton of football games. And I don't know that he's the long-term answer or that he's a top half the league QB. At this point, I'd say something like, the 20th or 21st best quarterback in football. But they have been starting backups more often than not. Dwayne Haskins, who may not ever start in the league again, Case Keenum, Alex Smith on one leg, Kyle Allen. I mean, these are the types of QBs they've had over the last few seasons. So Wentz is clearly an upgrade. Now, the problem is what they gave up, in my opinion, to get him, which was that they gave up a package as if you're going and getting an answer. They gave up a third-round pick this year and what will turn into likely a second-round pick next year. They also gave up $28 million of the $33 million in cap space that they had. So then they had to jigger a bunch of things and basically release and move on from players on their roster to try to have some cap for free agency. And it's been really quiet since. And it's been kind of like Carson Wentz and a cloud of dust because of how much he costs. So I think people are a little bit perturbed by how much compensation was and whether or not they had to do that. Could they have gone, say, with a cheap free agent and drafted someone? Could they have possibly waited and been more patient and gotten Matt Ryan on the cheap? I mean, there are questions like that. But if you just look at it as, look, you upgraded at the most important position in sports, then from that standpoint, I think what you get is a lot of fans that feel like they have a chance to be better at quarterback.
Understand where you're coming from a strategic point of view and a deal-making and financial point of view. At some point, you're going to have to get on the football field, and Carson Wentz may still have the capabilities to make plays. One thing I'm pretty sure, though, is he's not a leader of men. It came into question here in Philadelphia. It certainly was in question in Indianapolis and his one-and-done year there. If that continues to be the way Carson Wentz goes about his business by not being able to be a leader of men, who picks up the slack for the Commanders?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So that is the concern. We can come back to kind of the Wentz angle there. On offense, that's Terry McLaurin. Now, he is more of a lead by example guy than a talker. He's not going to give a speech per se. But Terry McLaurin's a special human being, guys. I mean, this is a terrific mensch of a man. You want him to date your daughter. You want a young kid to be mentored by him. He does everything the right way. He works his butt off at a position where you've long had divas and me-first guys. He doesn't have a boner like that in his body, and in fact, to his own detriment, perhaps. I mean, he is, as I said, had an egregiously bad quarterback play. It's hindered his performance. It's really hurt his chances of succeeding and thriving in the National Football League to the extent that he could. He's a 1,000-yard guy every year, but he should be a 1,300 or so yard guy, and he hasn't made a peep. He actually, statistically, was dead last in the NFL at the percentage of catchable balls on his targets thrown to him. Over the last 2 years, statistically, he has been dead last in that category over the summation of the 2 years. So we're talking about a guy that makes chicken salad out of you-know-what. He's the leader. He's the guy that kind of runs the show. I think that Charles Leno, the left tackle, has kind of become a bit of a leader of that offensive line as well. He's only going into his second season here, but they've already extended him and paid him. So those are a couple of the names I would give you on offense. The heartbeat of the team, the guy that kind of runs the whole locker room is Jonathan Allen, who's their defensive lineman who made the Pro Bowl last year. He's coming off of a phenomenal season, really played at a, probably not first team All-Pro, but like a, down the list All-Pro type level, had an awesome year, pushing the pocket, collapsing from the interior, stuffing the run. He's a former first-round pick at Alabama. So they got some dudes in that locker room that aren't going to allow a lack of leadership to be a problem. What I will say about Wentz, though, is, I talked to people with the Eagles. I talked to people with the Colts, more so really, frankly, with Indianapolis. And there is concern about his ability to just kind of get along. And it's not that he's a bad guy. I think people hear sometimes this idea that he's not great or ideal or perfect fit with teams in the locker room, and they think you're a jerk, and he's not by most accounts. What he is, though, is he's different than a lot of dudes, and I think at times that has led to some bristling and some annoyance and aggravation. And the question sometimes is, can you just be one of the guys? Can you just hang out and have conversations and go out with dudes and hang out? And from what I've gathered from a lot of people, that hasn't always been a strength of his, which is not a knock in real life, but in football sometimes it can be a little bit of an issue, and it has reared its head occasionally for Carson Wentz.
I say it all the time on this show, Grant. Dealt with Carson a lot. He's an introvert. He's not a bad guy.
Yeah.
He's an introvert playing a position that demands leadership, though. So it becomes a problem when other guys in the locker room perceive that he's not trying to be inclusive. That, to me, is what has been the problem. Yeah, it's what has been his problem. But I'm interested, because you're on the radio every day, 106.7 drive time, how Jim Irsay's comments went over in Washington at the meetings. Did that set off any alarms? Because, Jim was pretty harsh about what went on.
So it's funny you asked that. We talked quite a bit about that the last couple of days, as you'd imagine. I'll give you my take first, and then maybe like a little bit more of a fan perspective. It makes me feel better a little bit, because I don't care as much what an owner thinks as what football people think. If Dan Snyder, Jim Irsay, whoever it is, doesn't like a player, doesn't think a guy's a fit, or wants to draft a quarterback, that's fine. I care about Frank Reich's opinion. I care about Chris Ballard's opinion way more, because my question is, can this guy play football? Can he elevate players around him? Can he go out and win football games when the game's on the line late? Like those types of things. It's clear to me Irsay couldn't stand Wentz. Let's just start there. I mean, he wanted him out. Supposedly, according to The Athletic and Zach Kiefer, who wrote this story you're referencing, he's not overly involved normally, Irsay. And he got more involved than normal to guarantee and ensure that Carson Wentz would be out. Like, it was that important to him. Now, it does sound, if you read between the lines, like there was at least some bristling over perhaps Wentz's vaccination status, where he refused to get vaccinated. I'm not here to judge him for that or to comment on vac status, but I will tell you, if you're the owner of a team and you're paying a quarterback an amount of money that is prohibitive of having a good backup, and then a guy's not doing everything they can to stay on the field, I understand how that could make you feel some type of way. But if that's what sours the relationship, if that's part of why you don't like Carson Wentz now is because of that, and that leads to the beginning of the end, from sheerly a football perspective on what is Wentz going to be in Washington, I feel a little better about that, guys, than I would if it was like, oh, this guy's terrible at football. Now, that was obviously a big part of the problem, even though he didn't say as much, because if you look at the end of the season and how he performed the last couple of games, the fact that his yards per attempt were down around 6 for the last 9 weeks or whatever it was, like really, really bad numbers. It's all baked in here. It's all part of the conversation. But as specific to Wentz, I think it's a situation where Irsay wanted him out. Maybe Ballard got along. Maybe Ballard played ball. But Irsay wanted him out. And I think that makes Commanders fans feel a little bit better if it's the owner calling the shots than the football people.
All right, Grant, even though it is moved into the bronze medal slot, the biggest slap of the entire last 12 months is, of course, Chris Rock taking one from Will Smith. And I'd put the Juwan Howard taking a shot at a Wisconsin coach as well. But your two defensive linemen who went upside each other's heads during the season this past year certainly did get a lot of coverage on a national game, Jerron and Jerome Allen. Have those guys kissed and made up? Is that going to be an ongoing issue? I thought it was handled after it went down last year. Is anything smoldering there? Is that something the coach has to be on top of this season?
That's a good question. We haven't thought about it or heard about it in a while. It's an interesting thing to think about now in hindsight. Look, it hasn't been an issue. Those two guys were really, really close, and I'm assuming still are. I think those types of things happen. It was inexcusable, and the way it went down was pretty embarrassing on national TV during a blowout loss. Having said all that, here's the situation on the D-line is Allen, who I mentioned, is kind of their leader that runs everything and was part of why that happened. Daron Payne is maybe their second best player on the defense, but certainly their second best player on the defensive line, and he's going into a contract year. Now, they may lock him up and keep him around for the long term. He's another first-round pick out of Alabama 1 year after Allen, who's played really well. I'm opposed to that. I think it would be a terrible mistake in that, yes, he's a good football player, but do you really want to pay two D tackles, top of the market, $17 to $19 million a year money side by side? I think that's you get the same amount of money to spend, and you have to decide what's the best way to use it, right? And you're trying to be smarter than everyone else. To sink that kind of money into two interior defensive linemen just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So I would have shopped Payne this offseason. Didn't seem like they wanted to. Or I would continue to shop him into the season because he is really, really good, and see if you could get some assets back for him in draft compensation. My guess is they're going to negotiate with him. I don't think they'll lock him up, but they're going to try to. And if they don't, then he'll walk in free agency at the end of this year, or they could potentially franchise tag him if they don't have to franchise Terry McLaurin. Because remember, the biggest story here in Washington right now is the McLaurin contract. And with the wide receiver market exploding right now, Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill getting what they got, you got to pay this dude. He's going into the final year of his deal, and it's now or never kind of in terms of an extension before you could risk losing him. So I think that's the biggest story if you're a Commanders fan is, do they lock up McLaurin, and what does it cost in this exploding market?
Grant, you mentioned free agency as a whole for Washington has been pretty quiet outside of the Carson Wentz deal. They did lose a very good offensive lineman in Brandon Sheriff. Matt Ioannidis, who we know well from Temple. His agent wasn't happy about how that went down. He's out, so some depth hits there. They managed to get J.D. McKissick to do the 180. As a whole, have they improved? Have they gotten worse? Obviously, from the quarterback position, as you mentioned, they got better. But just for the rest of the roster, not a lot of splash either way, with the exception of Sheriff. Where are they? Improvement, do you see, or not?
Yeah, it's been really quiet. I mean, they're improved because they're better at quarterback, I think. Now, how much better or how improved, I think is a really fair question. You guys know all about Carson Wentz. There's going to be games where you think, oh, this guy's really good, and then games that are infuriating and maddening where you just have to assume that what is going on with this guy? He could be on his fourth team in 4 years. But I think overall the question is, what is the deal with their inability to add more pieces, and they just haven't done it here recently.
You mentioned the quarterback position. Oh, did we lose Grant? We'll see if we can
We'll
get
see
him
if
back
he
up
pops back up. He went muted, so maybe who knows? When you're outside, you might lose your signal, but hopefully we'll get Grant back. It is interesting to me for Washington's perspective, and there's Grant. He's back. From the standpoint of Chase Young, here's a guy you mentioned, Grant, the two best players on defense. And I'm not saying Chase Young is a bad player because Chase Young is a very good player, but I thought he was going to be a superstar player. Is there any disappointment relative to the expectations of when he came in as a high-level pick?
Immense disappointment in Chase Young. His first year was outstanding. Remember, he was the defensive rookie of the year.
Yep.
He had the most sacks of anybody in his draft class. He looked like he was on his way to becoming what everyone was told he was going to be, which was a defensive player of the year type, a game-changing presence, a game wrecker, so to speak. Fast forward to the offseason. He's not at OTAs. He's not at anything that isn't mandatory. At that point, the coaching staff said he'll be fine. He's working his butt off. He'll be here. He ended up having a quote last season where he was asked after a slow start, do you regret it or why weren't you here? And he said to a reporter, I was getting my money, boss, something like that. Meaning he was recording commercials. He was doing other things. I hope he's got a new lease on what this is all about, right? And it's not to say he doesn't work his tail off, because I really do believe he puts in more time in the gym. He knows what he's doing. He's a grinder. But I do think that after that first year, you do kind of the celebrity tour, so to speak. I think some things got out of whack for him, as evidenced by him not being around the facility as much. And the shame of it is he got hurt halfway through last year, right? So it needs to be said that part of his massively disappointing second season was an injury halfway through the season. And it was a bad one. He had a tear and is coming back from that ACL, and that's a tough recovery. Having said that, if you look at, I believe it was the 9th game he got hurt in, the 9 games he played in, they were not impactful. They were not really good. He had, I think, a sack and a half. He had like 3 or 4 quarterback hits. I mean, those, you have 5th, 6th round picks that kind of give you that kind of production. So make no mistake about it. It was a huge regression. It was a ultra disappointing year. And I would say that the tone from the fan base, where this guy was deified, and just kind of every jersey was Chase Young, and he was going to be the face of the entire franchise. Like, I didn't mention him when we brought up the leaders, but he was kind of the de facto leader of the team going into his second season already. All those types of things, I don't want to say went away last year, but they're on hold. And I do think there is, as always with any fan base, there's fans that are just going to, anything he says or does, they love, and he's still Chase Young and the generational end. But for a lot of people, it's now kind of, dude, you got to show me something. You've been in the league for 2 years, albeit, again, the serious injury second half of last year, which is disappointing. I feel awful for the player. But you're talking about like 9 sacks, and it's been more bark than bite. So it's time to make that leap. I mean, we were thinking they were getting Myles Garrett, TJ Watt, Von Miller kind of production. And now you're just hoping, like, can this guy become what Ryan Kerrigan was here for a decade before you guys brought him in as a bench option last year?
All right, Grant, we spent the first 15, almost 20 minutes talking on the field, which is what we prefer. And we could go to Dan Snyder and issues off the field and do another hour thereafter. But we'll save that for a rainy another day. But I do want to ask you one off the field question, and that's about the stadium. Last year, major issues. It's been a bad stadium basically since they built it, but it is now well before its time, already falling apart at the seams, and the Commanders are doing what they have to do to try and get a new stadium underway. Any new news? Any good juicy rumors? How is the new stadium, when and if it ever comes about, gonna shake out down there in DC?
Yeah, I'll give you a little State of the Union on that, because there's actually a timely update from yesterday, matter of fact. So it's pretty incredible what's happening with the stadium. So they play right now in Landover, Maryland. Let's start with that. That's about 20 minutes. Well, depends on the day and the traffic, but basically you can get there in 20 minutes from wherever you're at in downtown DC without a whole lot of traffic. Now, on game days, it can be a nightmare. I say that to say that when you're at the top of the stadium, you can see some of the really important buildings and monuments and things in the nation's capital. It's very close in proximity to DC, but they are not playing in DC, and they have not been since the mid-90s when they left RFK Stadium. Every fan, almost to a person, wants them to be back in DC, and ideally would like them to be at the RFK site. Because DC doesn't own that land, it's like nationally protected land, it's pretty complicated. They also aren't that interested in doing business, it doesn't seem like, with Dan Snyder, who's dealing with, as you've referenced, sexual harassment allegations, sexual misconduct allegations within the organization, where they were fined $10 million, and his role with the team had to change last year. And now there's an investigation by Congress and by the NFL into his own alleged activities and issues. So with all that swirling, DC, Maryland, and Virginia aren't fighting in this battle royale that everyone anticipated to get this stadium. That's the fan base. It's made up, you obviously have some national following with people that move, but it's Virginia, it's Maryland, and DC. We call it the DMV. And the thought was that all three of those states, municipalities, what have you, locations, would be fighting over the team. And it's just not happening. So Virginia originally has been the front runner to get the stadium. But here's where we are now. What was expected was they were going to offer the team basically $1 billion in taxpayer money for what is supposed to be a little over a $3 billion stadium. Well, Maryland and DC came and said, "Oh, you can have. We'll do the stadium here too, but we're giving the team almost nothing in terms of taxpayer money." And so it seemed like it's a no-brainer. They're going to Virginia. The problem is that the locations in Virginia are either way out west, like 45 minutes from the city, which is a bad idea with a stadium because then nothing's around it, and you have to build everything up around it, or closer to the city, down 95 in one of the worst traffic areas already in the country. So people are kind of uneasy about both of those locations. The Maryland location is where they are now in FedEx Field, which, while proximity to DC is fine, there's nothing out there. It's one of only 2 stadiums in the NFL that doesn't have a single restaurant or bar within a mile of it. There's nothing to do. It's a terrible location. It's one of the biggest problems the stadium has. So the easy answer is DC with Metro, with public transportation. But it seems like of the 3, they're either the least interested or right now the least invested in jumping into the fray, and time is ticking. Their lease is up in 27. It took the Rams like 4.5 or whatever years to build SoFi. I think the Raiders were able to pull their stadium off in a little under 3 years, but it's got to be done now. And just yesterday, we had a guy on my show, Grant and Danny in DC, who's covering all this for Channel 9 locally in DC, who said he's talked to a source who told him that Virginia is considering lowering their taxpayer bid that they're offering the Commanders, that they would not pay $1 billion, but $350 million.
Ooh.
I mean, think about that. You're lowering it by 65%, and it would still be more money than they're getting from DC or from Maryland. So they basically came onto the car lot and said, "We'll give you $100,000 for a car that costs like 40." And then the other 2 bids came in at like 27 and 30, and they're like, "Actually, we'll give you 40." So, I mean, it is going in the wrong direction right now for Dan Snyder and the Commanders, if you believe all of this reporting. Obviously, it could be politics. It's one unnamed state senator. Maybe that person doesn't want the stadium or the team or whatever. But they were saying things like, with each passing day, it's clear that, this team's lacking gravity that it once had. I mean, one of the comments from this state senator was that they're not sure if the team's going to be viable in 5 or 10 years. I mean, it's really kind of ugly, and it's not what you'd expect, because there's a huge, as you guys know, unbelievably passionate following, all being a dwindling one over the last several years because of Snyder and the lack of winning. But to be here already where, the time is getting closer to when you got to make a decision, and it's not a room where everyone's lifting up their paddle to bid and fighting with each other. It's like people are like kind of sheepishly, maybe, like it's bad right now. So it's really interesting to see where this goes.
All right, you mentioned Grant and Danny in DC 106.7 The Fan. Last one from me, Grant. You follow Grant on Twitter at Grant H. Paulsen. Is Daniel Snyder the problem here? Obviously, nobody knows politics better than you guys. You're in the midst of it, the center of it. You talk about the 3 different municipalities, essentially, in the DMV. do people not want to do business with Daniel Snyder? I mean, this is a very viable team. I think as soon as you get that stain off it, is the NFL working? Is there any rumors down there about the NFL trying to get Daniel Snyder out of this business, so to speak?
So it's a good question. It's so unrealistic, though, that he's going to end up losing the team or forced to sell.
Did it, Grant, in basketball?
Yeah, but not unlike when players get in trouble, there was audio. It was hard to run from that. Remember, and the precedent. Do you want to lower the precedent? And I say that not in any way to take away from the very courageous stories told by the very courageous women that have come forward to talk about the wrongdoings in that workplace. But so far, you have Jerry Richardson, who had several allegations against him directly. There was never really a specific allegation against Snyder directly until very recently, and it's just starting to be investigated now. Previously, it had been that the workplace was toxic and awful for females. And while that's Snyder's team and he's largely in charge, there was nothing that was kind of tied directly to him. So you'd be changing the threshold, and the people that need to change that bar are other owners who I perceive to probably have skeletons in their own closet. I mean, you need 24 of 32 owners to roll on him and say, we want him out. Unlikely. I don't think it's happening. The only way that would happen, in my opinion, is if enough sponsors pull out and the bottom line is affected. Remember, they didn't want to change the name. Dan Snyder never wanted to change the name. Nobody with the team wanted to change the name. The name is now Commanders. And the reason was FedEx, name of their stadium, Fanatics, all these places that sell jerseys, Nike, whoever else, I don't remember the specifics, but they basically said, we're not going to sell your team's gear and merchandise and jerseys anymore with this name. And it got to a point where financially, Dan Snyder couldn't keep the name and make the money that he needs and wants to make. So the only way to kind of relate this to your question, that he loses the team is when the Redskins football team turned Commanders and Dan Snyder are costing the NFL money and sponsorships. Well, if you notice, 3 sponsors have pulled out this offseason. Only one of them is a major sponsor, in my opinion, and that's Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch has 26 teams. They're still doing business with them. They have a decade-long partnership with the NFL. They just re-upped. I just went to an event yesterday in town with the Nationals where they're handing out beer and jerseys. They're very involved in the city, but they are no longer doing business with the Commanders. They did not release a statement as to why. They did not reference Dan Snyder. They just said, we're not going to be dealing with them. We look forward to continue our relationships with 26 other teams and the NFL. That's a huge deal. So if that kind of thing continues to happen, at some point, Roger Goodell or someone at the league office is going to have to say, well, wait a second. Is this worth it to us to keep defending this person? But I do think we're a long ways away from that. And if you're asking me, is there a better chance Dan Snyder's the owner in 20 years or not? I would still bet on him being the owner because this guy hasn't lost. He kind of always ends up on top.
GP, last thing, and thank you very much for coming on with us today. You may have acquired Nelson Cruz, but we got a whole bunch of boomsticks here in Philadelphia this year, and they're coming down to your place to hit the ball out of your park. I'm very excited about the Phillies lineup. I know how big a baseball guy you are. Does a great job, by the way, on Sirius XM on Sunday mornings with minors and majors. Not only does he talk Redskins start of the week, but the best of the young players in baseball on the weekends on Sirius XM. Grant, we appreciate whenever you talk to us. Thanks for hopping on, buddy. And you got a hell of a neighborhood there. We got to see almost all of it.
Yeah, I basically took the dog for a walk. I apologize. Right before I was coming on, both of my kids decided that I was not allowed to be in the house anymore to do this. So then it was me and the dog out. We got kicked outside to the curb here, so we walked down the street. But
I have been there many times, Grant.
I said, oh, well, it's going to be awkward scenery. It's going to be loud crying. So I didn't want to give anyone any PTSD who used to have kids. But I'll say this real quick, Jody Mack. A, I was glad that you brought up baseball because I thought this will be our first chat where that never came up. And then B, you guys are loaded, man. Between Castellanos and Schwarber back-to-back there, it was a kick to the ribs in D.C. of everyone because, the Nats are not going to be particularly good, but you thought, okay, you got to deal with the Mets and you got to deal with the Braves. Now you got to deal with the Phillies too. And they still got a little ways to go pitching wise probably, but They're going to be a blast to watch when they're at the plate.
The Broad Street Boomsticks are coming down to D.C. a whole bunch this year. GP, always a pleasure. Thanks for doing it, buddy. We'll talk to you again
see
soon.
you guys. Be well. Keep up the good work.
That is Grant Paulsen from 106.7 The Fan down in D.C. I know him from Sirius XM's MLB channel. Just a good dude, and man, can he give you background information, and I think he did a nice job for us talking the Commanders. I'm already better at that than I ever was with the football team.
Washington
Maybe because it's a couple of years removed from the Redskins. It took me forever to get off the Redskins, but now I'm pretty good at calling them Commanders right off the bat. All right, we'll come back. I'll talk to Commander John McMullen, and we'll put a bow on the show next here on Birds.